Lowering standards to increase supply. That is how the Minister for Housing described new guidelines for apartment building issued today. The changes will allow developers to build slightly smaller studio apartments and build more of them within the same complex. They would remove restrictions on the mix of units and would allow for fewer windows and lifts. Speaking on his way into Cabinet, James Brown said the measures would result in savings of between €50,000 and €100,000 per unit.
We have the highest standards in Europe, and we know that is impacting on the viability, therefore the delivery of homes in this country. Having the highest standards apartments that are never going to be built are of no use to anybody. We want to get the high standards but ensure that that viability piece is met. Having beautiful high standard apartments that never come off the design sheet is useless to people who need homes in this country.
Joining me to discuss this are Gael TD James Geoghegan, Sinn Féin TD and Housing Spokesperson Eoin Ó Broin, political correspondent with the Irish Daily Mail Sarah McGuinness, and Michael O'Flynn, Chairman and CEO of the O'Flynn Group. We're also joined by Robin Mandal, the former President of the Royal Institute of Architects in Ireland. You can send us your comments. Simply scan the QR code or contact us via the WhatsApp number. Sarah, give us a bit more detail, if you can, on exactly what changes were announced today.
So yeah, Kieran, this is the latest in kind of a slew of drastic changes that have been announced by Housing Minister James Brown in recent weeks, except this one looks slightly familiar because it was actually introduced in 2018, subsequently scrapped in 2020 and then resurrected today. So in terms of just kind of putting this in context, this is going to see flats, essentially, the size of them reduced down, so their minimum requirements are going to be reduced. So it's mainly looking at studios and larger apartments like that could house 4 people. So a studio apartment is going to be reduced from 37 square metres to 32 square metres. To put that in context, that's about the size of an average hotel room, 32 square metres. It's also going to reduce 3-bedroom flats for 4 people down from 90 square metres to 76 square metres. So that 14 square metres is essentially another bedroom that they're going to be knocking off and cramming it in. And Niamh Toomey, actually, from the Irish Times, had this really great comparison today for anyone who's watching Wimbledon, a standard doubles court that you'll be seeing on your tellies. You're going to be able to fit 8 studio apartments in 1 court under these new reforms. And as you mentioned there's going to be fewer windows. So there was this kind of dual aspect rule before where there had to be at least two walls with windows on them that could open. That's gone. It used to be a rule where you had to have no more than 12 apartments to 1 lift. That's also gone. There's also changes to the amount of cultural space you have to have in there, the amount of common space you have to have in there. So ultimately, this boils down to the argument of, people are saying they need apartments. What will they put up with? And I think the point was made at the Housing Commission earlier that a lot of these apartments are likely going to be built to rent. So they won't even kind of be coming on stream for people to buy. That's kind of yet to be cleared up. But I suppose it's really this kind of question of what people are willing to pay for and put up with in the fight to get housing in the country.
James, why are you doing this?
Well, I think you framed the question to this debate the way that the government have framed the answer, which is this going to increase supply? And the measures today are part of a suite of measures with the intention of increasing supply. And the reality is that apartments are not being constructed in Dublin in particular, but in Ireland to the extent that they were, for example, even just 2 years ago, a reduction of 25%. And when we look at the housing figure that everyone now acknowledges were disappointing for last year, it wasn't the houses, and I should say in respect to the houses, it was first-time buyers getting access to those houses that caused the reduction. It was apartments. And what has happened today is there's a whole suite. It's not really fair enough to say that this is sort of a reversion to one specific type of guideline that existed a couple of years ago. What they've actually done is they've looked at a whole suite of measures in respect of standards. They've also looked at what are apartment standards like in other cities across Europe, Utrecht, Birmingham. Back in 2023, the Department of Housing had a good look at this in terms of housing standard sizes, apartment standard sizes. And we're actually way above the standard. And what we're trying to do is ensure that the type of apartments that the funders, the private finance out there is willing to build, that they can do so in this country and in this city.
So the saving of between 50 and 100,000 euro that the Minister talks about, that's a saving for those developers or those funders. That's not a saving for the punter, is it?
So the figure that the Housing Minister gave in respect of 50,000 and 100,000 euro was done by the Land and Development Agency. The Land and Development Agency undertook a cost analysis.
Who's that saving for?
Ultimately, that will be the saver for the person who is going to buy that home. But I think it's important to put this...
Does that not contradict what you've just said? If the argument is you're going to squeeze in more and lower the standards to make it more viable for investors to build these apartments and to fund the building of these apartments, you can't then in the next breath say we're actually going to pass that saving on to the customer at the end of the day.
Yeah, well, I think...
To make it more viable, that saving is going into the pocket of the investor.
I think it's important to say that the guideline figure that the Land and Development Agency, I'm quite sure that right now, these were only announced today. I'm quite sure right now that the major developers around there who have, there's over 50,000 apartments that have planning approved in Dublin alone that haven't moved. I'm quite sure they're looking at all these measures and they're assessing it against their existing permissions and saying, well, look, is this going to make this planning permitted?
Yeah, sorry, I understand that. I don't want to get bogged down on
viable.
exactly how they calculated the figure, but you do understand the point I'm making about the hypocrisy of suggesting that this makes the building or the funding of building more viable, and then in the next breath say we're actually going to pass on that funding as the person who buys or rents the apartment.
No, that's not the point at all. The point is that the reason private developers are not constructing apartments in Dublin or in Ireland is because there's no end user, there's no purchaser, whether that's a big purchaser that wanted to buy this block and then rent it out to tenants, or whether that be an individual purchaser that wanted to buy that apartment to live in. There's neither of that demand. That doesn't exist at the moment because of the structure that we have. And you can blame a lot of things for that. You can talk about the cost of finance that have changed over the last number of years. But you can look at the things that we can control. And some of the things that we can control are standards, are RPZ, are ensuring that we extend the planning permissions. And of course, there's a new housing plan to come in September. So it's about looking at all of those things and ensuring that we get the level of private investment that we did have that actually exited Ireland, and to get it back here so we can construct apartments to get the housing figures to the level that we need to get them to.
Robin, are you encouraged by this? Do you think this will lead to the building of more apartments in this country?
I don't for 1 minute believe that it will. We've been here before. For the last decade, government has done what the property industry has asked it to do to increase supply, starting from Alan Kelly right up to every single minister to date. And as Sarah said, this is really a repeat of the build to rent. None of these measures succeeded. The height guidelines didn't succeed. The SHDs didn't succeed. The lower standards that Alan Kelly brought in didn't succeed. The build to rent didn't succeed. None of these things succeeded. So why the government thinks it will succeed now is beyond comprehension. Absolutely unbelievable. The sign of madness is doing the same thing all the time and expecting a different result. This will not produce supply, produce additional supply, nor will it produce affordable supply. And I'm glad that James mentioned the report that his department did, which was comparators of cost. This notion that our standards are far higher than everywhere else in Europe is nonsense. It's absolute nonsense, as that report shows. And that report says specifically that our costs are in line with European norms, that the only additional is 1% above the cheapest other city that they studied. That's minuscule. They recommended for reducing our costs to go to modern methods of construction and standardization. Nowhere did they mention reducing the design standards of places that people have to live. And this notion that report said we could get 14% reduction, and that was on apartments of 250, a build cost of 250, 275,000. You don't have to be a genius to do the maths to realise that 50 to 100,000 out of a 250, 275,000 build cost is utter nonsense.
So, Robin, if it's your contention, then it won't lead to cheaper apartments, it won't lead to more apartments. What will it lead to? Will it change anything in the market?
It will further delay any delivery that there is going on out there, because every time, and I'm sure Michael will agree with me on this, if nothing else, every time the government changes the rules, it upsets the apple cart. What What we need is certainty. We need certainty in planning. We need certainty in design standards. We need certainty in how we're going to deliver these things. And again, this notion that that international investors are our salvation, that hasn't happened for a decade. In the last 4 years, international investors have put in $5 billion, $500 million last year. Right? That isn't going to do anything. And we need, according to the industry, foreign investment of about 12 to 18 billion. We're not getting anywhere near it. We have to look at how we can solve this and provide homes for our citizens and the people who live in this country, instead of further enriching those who produce the supply. The cost will not go down, because the longer a developer delays in building something, with costs going up, with sales costs going up between 5 and 10% per annum, every year they make another 40, 50 grand. If we're looking at viability, we should be looking at the cost of land. We should be looking at the profit margins. We should be looking at the other soft charges. We should be looking at the things that we will not impact on the quality of the lives of the people who will live in these places.
Michael O'Flynn, on that. Michael, what impact do you think this will have on the market?
Well, first of all, you have to welcome anything that will help towards improving the viability of apartments.
And will this?
We have a serious viability issue. There's no doubt that any change that improves viability is welcome. But the viability impact here is minuscule. It is very little. But it's one of a suite of measures, and there has been more recently, that is going in the right direction. But we're coming from a very bad place as regards viability. We're coming from a very poor place as regards the gap between what is possible to build and what something is worth when it's built. And there's no point in us creating false expectation that all of a sudden this tweak is going to change the housing market or the apartment market. It's not. It's welcome, delighted that the government are dealing with change. But the scale, and some of it has been outlined there, the scale of the issue is quite enormous.
Yeah.
And we have to deal with a lot of issues, and not just the minor tweaks we're talking here.
Well, what about the point that Robin makes, that constantly tweaking the rules and regulations and the building standards and everything else, that actually is a kind of a counterproductive effect?
Yeah, look, I don't want to get alarmist about some of the comments that people pass, or indeed get too political about what changes. We are way ahead in Europe when it comes to standards. We have to understand that if we're creating product that people can afford to buy or rent, whatever mechanism of funding, it has to be on the basis that it's affordable. And have no question about it. We had standards here, and I'm not for a moment suggesting we should lower standards, but we had standards here that we just simply could not afford. And it doesn't mean that these new standards are subservient or in some way won't serve the people who are in a transitional period or people in a stage of life. But
is there not an argument that you just do nothing and you just allow the market to get accustomed to the reality?
But the reality is we did nothing for far too long. We've allowed a market situation
but now
get to a place where there's a massive...
Like, this is the problem with tweaking all the time, isn't it? Like, if you were an investor, you'd look at it now and what you'd say is, you know what, this is great, but I'm actually going to do nothing, because in all likelihood this government is going to do something else in 6 months' time to make it even cheaper to build apartments. And then 6 months later, they'll bring back in Section 23 tax breaks or an upfront financial incentive. Just hold firm and do nothing.
Well, I've been saying for a long time, we need to face the reality of what is the cost base, what can be afforded. I was on the Housing Commission. We put a lot of work into what is the demand, what are the requirements. Face up to those stark figures. And if you face up to those figures, you realise we have a serious problem on the viability side. We need to look at VAT on apartments. Like, people cannot afford to pay VAT on apartments. There are other changes that could be made. We have to look at the cost base. We have to look at a blank page and say, what can people afford? And I'm saying this as a developer, insisting that we must have value for money. We must have an open book approach. And in case people think that, you mentioned tax breaks, I don't want tax breaks. I want a viable business. I want a business that's capable of employing, buying materials, building a product and selling it at a profit. Otherwise, we can't fund it and it can't happen. Like, Kieran, we have a massive deficit of housing and apartments in this country. Yeah. We are going nowhere at this moment in time. These tweaks are helpful, but they're only touching the edges.
Eoin, you'd keep tweaking if you'd your way.
No, I'd make some very radical changes. But the first thing we need to say about today's announcement is the big losers are renters. 2 weeks ago, the Minister outlined his intention to completely hollow out rent pressure zones. And the types of rental properties that will have no protections whatsoever are new builds. What they have put in place today is a set of rules which are going to lead to apartments that will be smaller, that will be darker, that will have less amenities, and where the density mix isn't based on what's needed in an area, but what suits a developer. So the government's solution to the so-called viability problem is to charge renters more money for poor quality apartments, and that's just a fact of the matter. My big concern is not only that, but actually I don't think it's going to positively impact on viability, because what happens when you increase the density that's permitted on a plot of land? The value of that land increases, and within a very, very short period of time, any viability gains will be completely wiped out. That's what happened when Eoin Murphy introduced this in 2018. And on top of that, it's going to create this terrible uncertainty, because as of today, there are now 2 sets of rules in Dublin. If Michael wants to do an apartment development in Dublin today, he has to make a difficult decision. Does he go with what's in the city development plan, which has very specific rules, or does he go by these new rules? And if he takes one or the other, is he going to be at risk, for example, of judicial review? The primary reason why we had a surge of judicial reviews for large-scale residential or for high-density developments in 2018, 19, 20 was the conflict that Eoin Murphy created between the development plans and his regulations for apartments. That problem has since been solved. We're seeing a dramatic reduction in those types of judicial reviews. So you're going to punish renters, you're not going to tackle viability, and you're going to create confusion and delay. And for me, the worst thing is this, because Michael and I are at complete agreement on one issue. There is a huge viability problem. And I agree with Michael when he says what residential developers need is they need a viable model. There are much better ways of tackling these issues without punishing renters. When I talk to folks who want to deliver apartments in Dublin, people who have currently been priced out of the market completely, they're telling me they need lower cost finance, they need more timely planning permissions, they need quicker and preferably fee waivered utility connections. They need better use of master planning to de-risk them. What we need is actually a method of supporting residential developers who want to do high-end developments or high-density developments to get on site quicker with less delays, less risk and less cost. But if anybody is telling me that the solution to increasing supply is punishing renters, they don't understand the problem. And two things that have to be said. The Minister is wrong when he said we have the highest apartment standards in Europe. The department has done no assessment of that. There's one report making that claim. It's by Irish Institutional Property, the lobbyist for the big institutional investors. It is simply not the case. And James is wrong when he says that the problem is the lack of private sector investment in apartments. The reason why the government didn't meet their 33,000 new build target last year was on the public side. 3,000 social and affordable homes that were meant to be delivered that weren't. What are we going to do with these apartment permissions? We need the state to step in and through cost rental and through social rental, acquire those so people can actually have affordable homes, not €3,500 a month down in James's constituency in the Glass Bottle site, because they made a mess of this the last time and they're making a mess of it again.
Look, I look forward to those houses being completed, and there's 500 already completed, and I look forward to also the Lewis to Poolbeg being extended there. But
no affordable homes, James.
But no, the
no
homes,
homes
as you know, they're delivered under the affordable home scheme. And
but there's no agreement on those affordable housing schemes.
Well, you know as well as I do that the planning scheme requires them to be delivered under an affordable scheme.
But they can't because the viability
let's deal with the issue at hand here. And the fact of the matter is that there was a 24% decrease in apartments last year. That's not something that I'm particularly proud of or anyone in government is proud of, but that is a reality that government has to face. And when
this might reduce it further this year, mightn't it?
When Eoin says,
but won't it in the short term?
Well, if I could just answer the question, when Eoin says,
I didn't actually ask the question. I just asked you to respond to what Eoin said, which you've done. So now let me ask you a question: is there not a possibility that in the short term this actually delays the provision of housing? Because if you were a developer today and you had planning permission on a site, you'd be looking at it thinking, hold your horses.
No,
Here.
the minister announced, just one point of clarification. The minister announced a really controversial provision this evening. He's going to allow developers with existing planning permissions to retrospectively apply the new rules without any consideration for...
Yeah, he says, as long as you don't change the exterior of the building as well, which, I mean...
But that's still a huge and controversial change to our planning system, and one that's legally very questionable.
If it even makes sense.
Well, hold on.
Not if it leads to more judicial reviews and more delays in the courts.
So on the one hand, you were saying this is going to delay it, and Robin, who I respect and is also a constituent, also was saying that this was going to delay. The minister, like Eoin just said there, the minister did announce that tomorrow at committee, he's going to introduce a committee stage amendment such that essentially a developer with existing planning permission just has to notify. So you're not delaying the process. But look, obviously, when you change measures, there's going to be impact. Now, the question is, do you balance the change in the impact versus the let's get apartments built again in Dublin and in Ireland? And when you say punishing renters to what apartments? The apartment decline is a big problem. Government have to respond to it. The suite of measures, including the housing plan that is going to come, is about increasing the supply. And I think your viewers at home recognise that.
Michael?
I don't accept for a moment that when Eoin says we're punishing renters. I mean, that's too simplistic a comment to make. Why are we punishing renters? We have to face up to the reality that we have a massive deficit and shortage. And in relation to the measure that we don't have to go and get back and get planning, without that measure, this thing was absolutely useless. So the minister, in fairness to the government, had to look at that. But you have to be practical here and say, how can this make a difference quickly? It can make a difference quickly if it can be applied. And I don't accept for a moment that because...
Can be applied? I mean, if you have planning, is it easy to squeeze in an extra 3 units without changing anything in the exterior of the building?
Yeah, but I mentioned already value for money. I mentioned already there are ways and means. I've mentioned many times publicly before there's something on statute called certificates of reasonable value. There are ways of clarifying value for money. But if we look at it, the suggestion, and I've heard this as well in another programme last weekend, that, oh my goodness, these extra apartments will make more money for the developers. Like, the developer product at the moment is so far off viability that there is no prospect of that happening. And these measures alone won't change the dial. We have to face up to the fact we need massive change.
Tight on time. And I do want to go to Robin before we take a quick break. Robin, what would change the dial?
What would change the dial would be to stop the centralisation of planning to central government, who do not understand the issues on the ground. And I think Michael would probably agree with me on that. The other one is he won't agree with me on, and very few maybe would agree with me on. But we have to accept that the assetisation of housing has been an utter failure from day one, from the day that we had the great financial crash and we assetised housing. It completely started the rot. And our whole system is now based on the premise of increasing value and cost to residential units. That's what drives it all. That's why it is bound for failure and probably social unrest. So what we should do, and Michael was on it and has said it, we should do what the Housing Commission recommended and not the fudge that the department pretended it was doing. We should do what they did and we should stop letting lobby groups drive government policy. We should stop the regulatory capture of government by the property lobby.
All right.
It has served nobody.
We're going to have to leave it there. My thanks to Michael O'Flynn and to Robin Mandal.